The city was built on noise, but beneath that noise lived a quieter truth. People were constantly being overlooked. In offices, in hospitals, in shops, and on sidewalks, countless lives moved through each day without being truly seen. It was easy to dismiss someone when their struggles were invisible, when their worth was not printed on their clothes or written in their job title. And in one glass-covered building that stood proudly over the downtown streets, a single decision would set a chain of consequences into motion. The building belonged to Hallbrook Financial, a powerful firm that thrived on speed, numbers, and appearances. From the outside, it gleamed with success, but inside, it ran on pressure and fear. Employees worked long hours, afraid to fall behind, afraid to be replaced. In a world where profits mattered more than people, compassion was often treated like a weakness. Among the hundreds of workers who filled its cubicles and conference rooms was a quiet man named Aaron Cole. Aaron was not the kind of employee who drew attention. He did not speak loudly in meetings or boast about his accomplishments. He simply worked methodically and carefully, ensuring that every task he was given was completed with precision. For years, he had been the invisible glue that held certain operations together. When systems failed, Aaron fixed them. When reports were missing, Aaron found them. When problems arose, Aaron solved them before anyone else even realized they existed. Yet his value was never measured in applause. In a company obsessed with boldness and charisma, his steady reliability went unnoticed. His cubicle sat near a copy machine that jammed often, and many days. That was the only thing that seemed to acknowledge his presence. He did not complain. He could not afford to. His life outside of work was already heavy with responsibility. At home, Aaron cared for his aging mother, who struggled with worsening health and fading memory. Hospital bills piled up on the kitchen table beside unopened letters. Each evening, after a long day at Hallbrook, he rushed home to cook, clean, and sit beside her, offering comfort even when she no longer remembered his name. His paycheck barely covered rent and medical expenses, but he continued to push forward, believing that quiet perseverance would somehow be enough. One Monday morning, everything changed. A restructuring announcement echoed through Hallbrook Financial. The company had decided to cut costs, and layoffs were unavoidable. Department heads gathered behind closed doors, reviewing lists and weighing numbers. Lives were reduced to statistics. Loyalty was replaced by efficiency. Aaron's name appeared on a spreadsheet, highlighted without ceremony. To those making the decision, he was simply another line item, another expense that could be removed. His years of service, his dedication, his late nights fixing problems no one else wanted to handle, none of it was mentioned. He was dismissed with the same indifference that people often reserve for things they never truly valued. By noon, his access badge no longer worked. Security escorted him quietly through the lobby while others pretended not to look. The glass doors closed behind him, and just like that, he was no longer part of Hallbrook Financial. The building that had consumed so much of his life did not even seem to notice his absence. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Cars rushed past. People walked by with their eyes fixed on their phones. To them, Aaron was just another man standing on the sidewalk, holding a small cardboard box that contained his entire professional existence. Inside that box were a few photographs, a coffee mug with a faded company logo, and a small framed picture of his mother. As he held it, he felt the weight of everything he was about to lose. Without his job, the bills would not wait. The rent would not pause. His mother's medications would not become cheaper. Fear wrapped itself around his chest. But still, he stood there, trying to steady his breathing. What hurt most was not just the loss of income, but the realization that he had been so easily forgotten. Years of loyalty had been erased in minutes. He had been dismissed as if he had never mattered at all. Days passed, and the reality of unemployment settled in. Aaron applied to every job he could find. He waited on hold with insurance companies. He sold personal belongings to keep the lights on. Each night, he sat beside his mother, hiding his worry behind a gentle smile. She needed him to be strong, even as his world felt like it was slowly collapsing. Back at Hallbrook Financial, life went on. Or so it seemed. The company had eliminated what it believed were unnecessary roles. Departments were understaffed, but executives insisted everything was under control. They were proud of their efficiency, proud of their savings. The office buzzed with a nervous energy as employees tried to take on the responsibilities of those who had been let go. But something invisible had been lost. Small technical errors began appearing in reports. Minor system glitches caused delays. Numbers that once balanced perfectly started to drift. No one noticed at first, because the problems were subtle. But they grew. Aaron had been the one who quietly caught these issues before they spread. He had been the unseen guardian of their operations. Without him, the cracks began to widen. By the end of the month, Hallbrook Financial faced a serious crisis. A major client account had been compromised by a data error. Millions of dollars were suddenly unaccounted for, not because they were stolen, but because they had been mismanaged through a chain of overlooked mistakes. Panic spread through the executive floor. Meetings became frantic. Blame was passed from one department to another. They searched for the source of the problem, digging through logs and records. And slowly, uncomfortably, they realized that many of the systems now failing had once been maintained by a man they had dismissed, Aaron Cole. His name, which had been removed so easily from a spreadsheet, began to reappear in whispered conversations. People who had barely known him suddenly spoke of how he used to handle these exact issues. They remembered how he always seemed to fix things no one else understood. Regret crept into the corners of Hallbrook Financial, but it came too late to undo what they had done. While the company struggled, Aaron continued to fight for survival. He attended interviews that led nowhere. He watched his savings disappear. His mother's condition worsened, and with it, the pressure on his already fragile life. He had been dismissed today, cast aside as disposable. But the seeds of tomorrow were already being planted. The company that had once ignored him would soon find itself in desperate need of the very man it had pushed away. And the city that had walked past him without a second glance would soon be forced to witness the quiet power of someone it had never bothered to truly see. The first chapter of this story closes. Two worlds stand on the edge of collision, one built on pride and one built on perseverance, waiting for the moment when being needed would finally reveal the true cost of being dismissed. The collapse at Hallbrook Financial did not arrive all at once. It crept in through small, almost invisible failures, the kind that executives often ignore until it is too late. A misaligned data entry here, a corrupted backup there, and soon the firm that had prided itself on flawless performance found itself stumbling. Clients grew uneasy. Investors began asking questions. Trust, once taken for granted, started to fracture. Inside the towering glass building, stress replaced confidence. Meetings ran longer, voices grew sharper, and the polished smiles that once filled the halls faded into tight expressions of worry. The people who had made the decision to cut costs now found themselves trapped by the consequences of that choice. The systems they believed could run without Aaron Cole were unraveling, and no one else fully understood how to put them back together. Aaron, meanwhile, lived in a very different world. His days had become a careful balancing act between job applications, doctor's visits, and the fragile routine he maintained for his mother. Each morning, he rose early, brewed cheap coffee, and scrolled through listings, searching for anything that would allow him to keep providing care. He had not told his mother about losing his job. He did not want her to feel like a burden. Instead, he carried the weight alone. Even as it pressed heavier with each passing day, bills stacked higher. The landlord called. The pharmacy warned that medications would soon be withheld without payment. Aaron's life felt like it was shrinking, narrowing down to a single desperate goal: survive. Then, one afternoon, as rain streaked down the windows of his small apartment, a message appeared on his phone. It was from a number he recognized instantly. Hallbrook Financial. The company that had escorted him out with indifference was now reaching back toward him. The message was polite but urgent, asking if he was available to consult on a critical issue. Aaron stared at the screen for a long time. A mix of disbelief, anger, and quiet vindication swirled inside him. He had been dismissed as expendable, yet now, when everything was breaking, they needed him that he did not feel triumph. He felt something deeper and more complicated. He felt the weight of knowing that people who had once ignored his worth were now forced to acknowledge it. Back at Hallbrook, the crisis was escalating. A regulatory audit loomed, threatening heavy fines and public exposure. If the errors were not corrected, the company's reputation could be destroyed. Executives who had never bothered to learn Aaron's name were now scanning his old work records, Realizing how much of the firm's stability had rested on his quiet expertise, the realization was humbling. The firm had cut what it thought was excess, only to discover it had cut its backbone. Aaron eventually agreed to help, but on his own terms. He knew the power he held now. He also knew that his knowledge could mean the difference between a company's survival and its collapse. But more than that, it could mean the difference between his mother receiving her care and losing everything. As he returned to the building, not as an employee, but as someone whose value was finally recognized, the atmosphere was different. People looked at him with something close to respect. He was no longer invisible. He worked long hours, untangling the digital knots that had been allowed to grow in his absence. He restored systems, corrected data, and guided teams through processes they had never fully understood. Each solved problem was a reminder of what had been lost when he was let go. But something else was happening, something far more powerful than technical recovery. Aaron's story began to circulate. Employees whispered about how he had been dismissed despite years of loyalty. They spoke of how the company now depended on the very man it had cast aside. His situation became a quiet symbol of everything wrong with a system that valued numbers over people. And outside the walls of Hallbrook Financial, a larger truth was beginning to form. The man who had been dismissed yesterday was now the one holding tomorrow in his hands. Yet even as Aaron brought stability back to the company, his heart remained heavy. His mother's condition continued to decline. The world outside of work did not pause just because his professional worth had finally been acknowledged. He was still a son, still a caregiver, still a man fighting to keep his family from falling apart. As the second chapter closes, two forces move closer to a reckoning. One is a powerful company learning humility. The other is a quiet man discovering the strength of his own value. And neither will emerge unchanged when the final truth comes to light. As Hallbrook Financial slowly regained its footing, the building that once felt cold and indifferent toward Aaron began to change. His presence brought more than technical stability. It brought an uncomfortable mirror to the company's conscience. Every spreadsheet he repaired and every system he restored quietly reminded everyone that their crisis had not come from fate, but from a decision made without compassion. Executives now walked the halls with measured steps, their confidence replaced by careful observation. They saw how employees gravitated toward Aaron, not because he demanded attention, but because he radiated reliability. The same man who once sat forgotten near a broken copy machine was now the person everyone turned to when something went wrong. But with being needed came a heavy price. Aaron's days grew longer. He spent countless hours at Hallbrook, fixing what had been neglected for months. At night, he rushed home to his mother, whose health was slipping faster than any doctor had predicted. The memory of who he was faded more with each passing week, leaving him holding the fragments of a woman who had once been strong, who had once been his entire world. The money he earned from consulting helped, but it could not buy time. It could not restore her fading memories. It could not bring back the sense of peace that had vanished from their home. Yet Aaron kept going. There was a quiet dignity in his exhaustion. He did not seek praise. He did not demand apologies. He simply did what he had always done, even when it cost him deeply. At Hallbrook, the leadership team began to understand the full impact of their mistake. They saw how easily they had erased a person who carried the weight of an entire system. Their choice to dismiss him had not only endangered their company, it had endangered a family. Slowly, a change began to take root. The firm started reviewing how it treated its employees. Discussions about loyalty, support, and human worth entered boardroom conversations for the first time. The idea that people were not just replaceable resources became impossible to ignore. That Aaron's story was no longer just about one man being let go. It had become a symbol of how easily society overlooked those who held everything together behind the scenes. Outside the office walls, the ripple of that story spread. A local journalist learned of what had happened. An article was written about the quiet consultant who saved a company that had fired him. The piece did not focus on technical details. It focused on humanity. It told of a man who was dismissed when he was vulnerable and needed most when everything fell apart. Readers across the city felt something stir inside them. They saw their own struggles reflected in Aaron's. They recognized the way people were often valued only when it was convenient. Donations began to arrive for Aaron's mother's care. Messages of support poured in. Strangers reached out, offering kindness in ways he had never expected. But even as the world started to see him, Aaron remained focused on the same simple goal: to protect the person who had always protected him. The pressure of being needed by so many began to weigh on him. He felt pulled in two directions, torn between a company that now depended on him and a mother who needed him more than ever. As the third chapter draws to a close, the question becomes unavoidable. When someone is finally seen, when their worth is finally acknowledged, will it come in time to save what matters most? The answer waits in the final chapter, where karma and compassion will meet, and where being dismissed will be replaced by something far more powerful. The final weeks of winter brought with them a quiet stillness that felt heavier than any storm. In Aaron's small apartment, the ticking of the clock grew louder, marking time that no amount of money or recognition could ever buy back. His mother's health continued its slow decline, and with each passing day, the world she once knew drifted farther away. Aaron remained by her side whenever he was not at Hallbrook Financial, holding on to every fleeting moment as though it were a fragile thread connecting him to everything he loved. Yet outside those walls, something extraordinary was happening. Hallbrook Financial had not simply recovered. It had been transformed. The executives, once obsessed with cutting costs and maximizing profit, now carried the weight of their decision like a permanent scar. They had watched the company nearly collapse because they failed to see the worth of one quiet man. That lesson could not be erased. Under new leadership, policies were rewritten. Employees were no longer treated as disposable numbers, but as people with lives beyond their desks. Support programs were created for caregivers, parents, and those struggling in silence. The firm that had once dismissed Aaron without a second thought was now building a future shaped by the very compassion it had once ignored. And at the heart of that change was him. Aaron was offered a permanent role, not as a forgotten worker, but as a respected leader. It came with stability, healthcare, and a level of security he had never known. More importantly, it came with dignity. But even as his life began to stabilize, his greatest fear remained. The nights grew longer, and the moments of clarity in his mother's eyes became fewer. Yet, in her quiet way, she still felt his presence. There was comfort in his steady care, even when words were no longer there. And for Aaron, that was enough. News of his story continued to spread through the city. People who had never met him felt connected to the journey of a man who had been dismissed when he was most vulnerable and needed when everything fell apart. His struggle became a reminder that behind every job title and every uniform was a human being carrying unseen burdens. Then, one morning, something shifted. As sunlight poured softly through the curtains, Aaron felt a peace he had not known in months. His mother's breathing was gentle and steady. There was no fear, no urgency, only a quiet sense of closure. In that stillness, he realized that even though the world had finally recognized his worth, what truly mattered had always been the love he gave freely, without expecting anything in return. She passed away not in pain, but in the calm presence of the son who had never left her side. Grief arrived like a tide, heavy and all-encompassing. Yet beneath it, there was something else: gratitude. Aaron had been there. He had not abandoned her for work, for money, or for recognition. In the end, his greatest success was not saving a company. It was honoring a life that had shaped his own. Hallbrook Financial, now guided by the lessons learned through Aaron's journey, supported him fully through his loss. The people who once barely noticed him now stood beside him in his darkest hour. Their respect was no longer built on what he could fix, but on who he was. And so, the story came full circle that a man who had been dismissed as expendable became the foundation of a company's rebirth. A caregiver who had nearly lost everything found strength in the very compassion he had always given to others. A city that once looked away learned to see in the end. The greatest form of karma was not revenge or humiliation. It was understanding. It was the realization that every person matters, especially the ones who quietly hold the world together. And from the ashes of being dismissed today, something far more powerful was born: a legacy of kindness that would be needed forever.